Welcome back to Late Grade Classics, a podcast where we talk all things classic cars, from the brilliant minds who designed these cars to those that ushered the hobby into where it is today, and those who are bringing the hobby into the 21st century. My name is John Ruff, and I'm your host. This podcast is sponsored by Southeast Chevy Parts. If you've got a full-size Chevy from 1955 to 1970 and you need a part for that car, most likely we have it. Check out southeastchevyparts.com. This podcast is powered by Push Button Creative Audio right here in Central Florida. We do audio branding for brands all across the country. We do podcasts, radio commercials, voiceovers, jingles, audio branding, any way you name it. Check us out at pushbuttoncreativeaudio.com. Today, I'm with one of the people who ushered the hobby into where it is today. I've known this man since I was like 7 years old. I'm so excited to bring him over to the studio, Danny Howell. Thanks so much for being here, Danny.
Well, thanks for the invite, John.
So there's so much to start with. So, most people know Classic Chevy, Late Grade Chevy, and you started both of those.
Right.
So let's start from the beginning. So how did Classic Chevy come to be?
Well, let me begin by stating I certainly can't take all the credit. In fact, I don't even want to take most of the credit. It seems like all good ideas come from more than just a single mind. And an old college buddy of mine and I really fell in love with Chevrolets back in the mid to late 60s. And we actually bought a 57 two-door sedan and put a 409 engine in it. And we had lots of problems with that 409 engine, but we learned along the way, and we realized that we were really hooked on Chevys from 55 to 57, the shoebox cars.
Yep.
So it really started when we began to think about what was happening in the hobby. We subscribed to Hot Rod magazine, and you would see articles. I mean, the pages were filled with 55, 6, and 7 Chevys. There was a club that preceded us. It was the National Nomad Club, actually headquartered out in Colorado. And so we found out about it and actually joined. We didn't own a Nomad, but Nomads were 55, 6, and 7, and so we wanted to see what they were doing. We were hoping that eventually, once we became friends and spent some time together, that they might expand their club to accept other than just Nomads.
Nomads, yeah.
But after a couple of years at communicating with them and writing to them and talking with them on the phone, they made it vividly aware that the National Nomad Club was a Nomad only.
They're staying where they are. And
we'll love you if you like other 55, 6, and 7 Chevys, but if you do something, you got to do it on your own. And so in 1974, after a couple of years of talking and brainstorming, we actually decided to do that. And I want to be perfectly clear. Doug Moorhead was my friend. He was a teacher, a high school teacher. I was selling books in Wisconsin and had just accepted a position as a teacher. So we both ended up teaching high school. And as we thought about what to do, we really just didn't know what. But we knew we needed to get the word out, and one of the best ways to do that was through Hot Rod magazine. Now, you have to understand, we were 2 teachers living on a teacher's salary, and we didn't make a lot of money, but we decided that we needed to take an ad out in Hot Rod magazine. And it was a little 1-inch ad that basically said, if you're interested in joining a club for 1955, 56, and 57 Chevys,
right,
send us $10. Now, Doug had been teaching in Michigan.
So real quick, you hadn't even started the club yet.
No.
You just wanted to gauge the interest.
That's right. And so
right.
Doug had taken a position teaching down in Newport Richey.
Okay.
And so literally he was driving down, moving himself from Michigan down to Florida, and
not a bad
stopped along
choice.
the way, called Hot Rod magazine, and took out the ad.
Wow.
So it was his initiative. You have to understand, that was a very expensive ad for a couple of high school teachers.
Well, not to mention, there's no internet, right?
No.
So all you had were magazines?
Yep.
And that's it.
You had magazines you could advertise in, and you're right. I mean, and word of mouth, and that was it. And so we took out this ad, and it basically said, if you want to join a club for 55, 6, and 7 Chevy, send us $10. And we gave an address in Newport Richey. Here's the funny thing. We started with membership number 101. We decided we needed to preserve the first 3 member numbers for the 3 of us. It was Doug, his brother, and myself. But the real driving force was Doug and myself. But we took out that ad, and we were shocked when in the first month, 304 people sent us $10. Now, that was just 1 month.
Right.
And we realized...
How much did the ad cost?
I've tried to remember it. I remembered it as being something like $50 or $60, but
Sure.
That was so long ago I forgot. I just know that I knew what my teacher's salary was. I made $1,000 a month gross. And so whatever it cost,
It was a lot.
It came out of our pocket because, there was no cash flow.
Right.
So we took out that ad. 304 people sent us $10. And basically, we stepped back as teachers and said, whoa, we got to do something.
Right.
Now, we had never started a business. I came from I studied psychology and behavioral science and industrial arts in school, and Doug was a theology major. And so we understood people and how they get along. And we thought the best thing to do is to start this club. And so when 304 people joined, sent us $10, we said, we've got to do something.
Yeah.
And too bad I didn't have a copy of that very first magazine. It was 8 pages. It was photocopied or mimeographed, I should say. We didn't know what else to do. It was just black and white. And it listed us as the founders, and we managed to find pictures of those first, a few of the first 304 people. We told people to send us their photographs. Many of them were Polaroids, which were lousy to try to reprint. And we went down to a local art store, and we got edging material, and it was all hunt and paste and taped down. And, we were school teachers, so you were used to preparing stuff for a class, and we just did the same principle.
So do you think you broke even after doing all this and the postage and all that stuff?
To begin with, no, because we didn't know anything about mailing. So we mailed them first class. And back in those days, to mail an 8.5 by 11 first class envelope was really expensive.
Yeah.
And so, believe me, there was a sharp learning curve, but you learn by trying.
Yeah, of course.
And so, to be honest, the first year we had to plow our own money into it. There was really no other way. And primarily that money was plowed in by Doug, because we headquartered in Florida, and he was the one that got the printing done, et cetera, et cetera.
Are you still in Michigan, Wisconsin, or have you come down
I was still teaching high school in Wisconsin.
In Wisconsin, okay.
So we started Classic Chevy in November of 1974.
From a phone booth.
And we took the ad out in the summer, took a 2-month lead time.
Right.
So it wasn't until the fall. And so by the time they sent us the money, like in September, October, then we decided to put this little 8-page black and white together and mailed it out. However, by the second month, the word of mouth had begun to get out. And there were groups of people that had little clubs locally. There were clubs in California. And so what happened was it grew from that point exponentially. It was just mind-boggling to me what had happened. It didn't take us long to stand back and say, whoa, we've got to do something.
Right. So the local chapter started getting created.
Yep.
From this magazine that you guys sent out.
Yep.
With pictures of people's cars.
Yep.
How long did that take for those to start popping up?
I would say that the initial clubs probably started by the second or third year.
Okay, got it.
And we began to recognize them. In other words, we would list every every half a year a list of all the new chapters and if you wanted to join. And we eventually had chapters that were registered with us, and everyone in them were members of Classic Chevy. Others were just affiliated. They didn't require everyone to be a member. I mean, we were learning, on the fly.
Yeah, building the plane as you fly it, right?
That's right.
So okay, so you've got a magazine, you've got memberships. When did the parts element start to happen?
We learned quickly publishing the magazine. By the fourth year, we hired someone to be a layout and design artist because we really weren't artists. And so the parts really didn't start until about 1978.
Okay.
So we had been around for about 4 years. And again, it was a real hunt and peck kind of a situation. There's a certain mentality that you have when you belong to a club. And it was really from the members that we began to become acquainted with. Initially, before we started doing parts, we started doing an annual international convention.
Okay.
The very first one was held in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I think the second one was in Columbus, Ohio. What was interesting was people would show up, and back in those days, a swap meet was the place that you would find parts to restore your car. There were a number of things that were still available from GM, but very minimal. And lenses and gaskets and small trinkets, rubber, none of that stuff, or most of it, was no longer available because by 1978, when we began to do our first parts, the cars you can see from 1955 to 78, you're 20-some years old. And so there was a desperate need. And by the time we started doing parts, we were probably up to around 8,000 or 9,000 members. And what was happening was there were all these articles we would write. We'd find stashes of parts. Guys would go to old Chevrolet dealerships and buy out all their parts and bring them to the swap meet. Then we had the confrontation of a club and a business.
Yeah.
And we had to answer the question, are we a club and a business? Are we a business and a club? Well, we'd started as a club, to begin with. And people were complaining. For example, we had a gentleman that attended one of our very first conventions, and he had a brand new 1955 or 57, don't remember which, shop manual, and he was asking $25 for it. Well, back in 1976, 75, 76, that was a lot of money to pay for a manual. And so we had letters to the editor, and there was this discussion about how in the world should we do this because they were charging so much money for all these parts. And so what happened was, to begin with, we weren't really getting into parts, but we were kind of a buffer between the buyers and the sellers.
Okay.
But there were no new parts. It was just stuff that people had collected. And so it was just by happenstance that we'd done a lot of research up in Detroit. And so in the early magazines, we did a lot of technical articles, publishing what the color codes were and how to decipher a cull tag, how to decipher a vehicle identification number. And so we began to do that, but it wasn't long before the hobbyists really began to clamor. Let's do something. We needed something. So we literally projected the idea of, well, should we make a few parts? And one of the first things that we ever did was offer a lens gasket set for the 1955, 56, and 57 Chevy. They were cheap. We didn't know what we were doing. We were not trained businessmen, but we did figure out that there were companies out there that would do that. And so those were the first things we did.
Which lenses?
Pardon?
Which lenses?
And then we followed that with the lenses. The first lenses we did were the 57 turn signal lenses on the front, the round ones.
Okay.
We found a company that did injection molding, and and we were off. But the real learning came when it came time to figure out what to do, because we realized if you were going to restore a 55, 6, and 7 Chevy, you had to have a shop manual. and they simply weren't out there. This was long before the days of the internet. Maybe you'd find something in an old motor's manual, but Chevrolet had discontinued the shop manual years before that. And there were no companies out there that did just literature. Eventually, there became companies like that. But we had been to Detroit, and we had managed to find some original, very nice, Chevrolet shop manuals. And so we literally took them to a local printer here in Orlando, the printer that had been printing our magazine every month.
Yep.
And he knew we were faithful. He knew we paid our bills every month. But we just didn't have the money. We were still teaching school. Actually, by that time, we had both stepped down, but we were still new. And we still, whatever we paid ourselves was quite minimal.
Yeah.
And we just didn't know what to do. So we went to the printing company that printed our magazine every month, and we told the printing company, we have this harebrained idea. We had been given a copyright release for free from General Motors, specifically to reproduce the shop manuals, 1955, 6, and 7.
Was that hard to do?
It really wasn't. I'll be honest. Let me take a break here and say this. Ford had always encouraged the hobbyist.
Huh.
Ford had a different corporate philosophy. They were a more privately held company started by a single man that in the early years drove it. Henry was smart enough to create his own museum where he put his cars in.
Yeah.
Chevrolet didn't do that. Ford's corporate philosophy was a guy that buys an old Ford from us in a few years wants to buy another. And we want to encourage not only the current buyer, but the old guy. And so Ford, philosophically, from our observation point, seemed to be much more helpful to the hobbyist.
Huh.
And so we were hoping that Chevrolet would do that for us. We began to question General Motors. We had friends there that we had made over the years doing research and archives. We knew a few GM executives, but most of them were always overlooking their shoulder because in a corporate philosophy like GM, the total focus was not the past, but the future.
Right.
What can we sell to you tomorrow?
Correct.
We politicked and politicked and politicked, John. And I'll never forget, we finally got an audience with Mr. Lou Kalouche, who at the time was head of GM Parts Division. His office was in Flint, Michigan. We had done enough research. We actually knew where the tooling was for the backup light assemblies for the 1957. Wow. We knew where the backup lights were for the 55 and 6 were. It was a company called Howell and Company. We found the company that made them for GM and had been making them until recently. So we knew where the tooling was. We found where the tooling was for the 1955 Chevrolet front fenders. And so we requested an audience with Mr. Kalouche. Eventually, we had an appointment with him. We flew to Michigan, and we walked in to meet with Mr. Kalouche. And we walked in. We were loaded for bear. We had our magazines that we were publishing. By that time, we were up to about 14,000 members. And we said we represent a big audience of GM. We calculated that our average member owned at least 2 or 3 Chevrolets.
Wow.
And so we sat down with Mr. Kalouche. We're young, we're dumb, we're naive. We think Chevrolet wants us to be around. They love us. Look at what we're doing.
Right.
Look at this free advertising we're doing for them all the time in a Chevrolet magazine. We gave them copies of our magazine. We told them where the tooling was. We brought a bank letter of credit. And we had one request. We simply said, Mr. Kalouche, please, we will buy every part that you make. If you'll just stop, don't discontinue these 3 parts. You still have the tooling. At that time, John, we could buy through our local Chevrolet dealership a 1955 Fender for $65.
Oh, jeez.
And you
That's
could
crazy.
buy the license light assemblies very inexpensively, but GM was discontinuing them. So we gave him the best shot we had in the world. As we got near the end, I'm thinking, man, we've done a good job.
Right.
And I'll never forget, he had this beautiful, gorgeous, fancy office, leather chairs, plush. When we finished, he sat back in his chair, looked at us, thought a few moments, and I'll never forget exactly what he said. He looked at us and he said, boys, I'll be damned if I'm going to make GMPD into an old parts warehouse.
Wow.
And we stood up, shook his hand, walked out of that office with a tail between our legs and said, dadgummit.
Right.
If they're not going to do it, we have to do something.
Yeah.
And that was the motivation that got us started.
The birth of it.
The birth of it.
Wow. So what was that flight like home? I bet you, I mean, I'm sure you were disappointed. But now you've got, ammunition to
Right.
to go.
And so by this time, then, we approached GM. They gave us a copyright release, but we didn't have the money to print. We figured we had to print 2,000 copies of each of those 3 years. And that was a lot of money. So we went to our printing company and we said, look, we have this idea. We think we can sell a lot of these shop manuals. But here's how much money we have. If we buy the paper and the ink, will you provide the labor and the binding of the shop manuals? We will do a pre-sale. We want you to print 2,000 of each. That whole affair ran us about $20,000.
That was a lot of money.
Which was an awful lot of money for a couple of school teachers. But we managed to get by only having to pay half of that up front. So then we began to advertise. We were blown away. In the first 3 months from the time we started advertising, we sold out the first run.
Wow. That's so cool.
And we stood back as non-businessmen. We hit ourselves in the forehead and said, oh, my goodness, this works. What else can we do?
Right.
And so it was really a learn by experience.
And this is the early 80s now at this point?
This would have been in the early 1980s.
Early 80s. Okay.
And so it wasn't because we had this business plan. I often sat back and I sat in absolute amazement because we just stumbled upon this idea of starting a club. And we stumbled upon this idea, well, somebody has to do something. And I'll be honest, I was far more cautious than Doug. Doug just wanted to drive ahead. I was the quieter behind the scenes. Let's make sure we get all of our ducks in a row. Let's do this, buy the book kind of a thing.
Sure.
But that combination of the two of us was really what ended up driving, that beginning.
How was the profit margin on those manuals?
It cost us about $20,000. When we sold out the printing, we had about $40,000.
Okay.
And so the profit margin wasn't fantastic, but we stood back and we said, hey, we doubled our money. What else can we do?
Sure. So what's next to start on the parts for Classics?
It was really funny. I grew up in Michigan. My mom remarried when I was 14. My dad was the foreman of the largest die-cast division from a company called Keeler Brass. Before the war, he'd been a chauffeur for Mr. Keeler, but when the Second World War broke out, my stepdad's vision was not good enough to serve, and so his Mr. Keeler came to him and said, Francis, you can be chauffeur number 2. You've been chauffeur number 2 for a number of years. You do a marvelous job, but I can pay you more money if you go work in the factory. My dad often talks about chauffeuring a Lincoln Zephyr with a V12 engines and all of that cool stuff. And so I'd heard him tell those stories, and I realized that my stepdad was the foreman of the die-cast division of, one of the factories that Keeler Brass owned. And so I flew to Michigan with a suitcase full of parts. the 1955 Hoodbird, the taillight housings, the park light housings, the 57 hood scoops, and the 57
shiny stuff.
The shiny stuff. And it was so funny when I got home and I opened up my suitcase. Dad looked at him and said, "Oh, we made those pieces. Oh, I made those. Oh, Keeler Brass had made nearly all the parts in my suitcase." And it was so funny. He was so excited because I said, "Dad, we want to have these parts made, and you work at Keeler, so take me there and introduce me." And so I'll never forget. We went over to Keeler Brass. He walks in. I'm his stepson, and I knew him as my dad, and he's so proud. Here's my son. He loves these old Chevys, and now he wants to make these parts, and he introduced me to the powers that be, and I'll never forget. We got acquainted. They thought it was great. Here is Francis Boy, and now they want to make the parts again. And so we began to talk. One of the first things we talked about was the Hoodbirds. And I'll never forget because I don't remember the gentleman's name, but he looked at me and he said, "How many of these you want to make?" I said, "Well, we have to be careful, maybe about 200. And he said, "You mean 200,000? Oh, no. And I said, "No, I mean 200. And he started laughing at me. He said, "We can't make these parts and make only 200 of them. We make these in the hundreds of thousands."
Right.
In order to set up this die-cast machine and create the tooling, just to create the tooling is going to cost $10,000. And you want to make 200? And I put my tail between my legs a second time and walked out of that shop, and I realized that was not going to, we had to find little mom and pop shops that would make parts for us. So I have to tell you one of the first big projects we did, because it was a successful disaster. We found a company down in Batesville, Ohio, called Batesville Products. They did gravity-fed dies. In other words, these were not fancy steel dies. They were a kind of a cast die. I'm not a technician. I can't give you the correct verbiage. But it was gravity-fed rather than injected. And we were able to create the 1957 hood bar reproduction. It was a big piece. The problem with a gravity-fed die, the density of the metal when it's hot, in order to make it fluid, it don't have a lot of bubbles in it like die cast.
Okay.
And it's not injected. And so the hood bars ended up weighing more than double an original one. And the suckers, people would pick them up and, they would have to use them as weightlifting.
Right.
And they were just heavy. But we were able to do it, and we were able to sell them for like $150. And it was better than nothing, and so many guys had broken ones. Now, eventually there were good companies like Dick Miller, who'd started the company Trim Parts, that came along that wanted parts for his Corvette. And he started making injection dies, for the die cast. And that's what he did for a living. And so eventually those companies began to step in, and we realized our specialty was not reproducing parts and owning the tooling, but we had an avenue to distribute.
Sure.
With that monthly magazine, people would pay to join the club. We offered technical help, and now we began to offer parts. And so one of the first things that I did early on was fly around the United States and introduce myself to companies like like Art and Danny Danchuk from Danchuk Industries out in California, and convince them that we had this distribution engine and we should be one of their dealers. And so we early on learned from our failures and successes that there was a much better way of doing it, and our forte was not making things, but marketing them.
And distributing.
them, right.
All right, so you've got people that are now reproducing parts, and you guys are now the distributor of these parts. But I also remember, being a kid and being in the warehouse, that there was used parts. So when did you guys start purchasing used parts, and how did that come to be?
That's a really good question. But almost not right from the beginning, but I would say by by the mid-1980s, we realized that reproducing parts was going to be a real challenge. And in fact, I tell you what taught us that. We began to realize that a lot of people were advertising in the back of the magazine, and a lot of the ads were NOS or a lot of used parts. And there was an old-timer lived out in Las Vegas, Nevada, and he got a hold of us, and he said, I'm really old, and he was. And he had bought a couple of warehouses full of old Chevy parts, small warehouses, storage facilities. And he kept telling us, you need to come out here. You need to buy this stuff. You need to see the stuff that I have. And since I did most of the traveling, I got along well with people. It was decided that I would fly out and I would meet this gentleman. And I'll never forget going to his home, and then he would take me to a couple of kind of rental places. And he had hundreds upon hundreds of NOS parts tucked away in those garages. And it was, I think the year was 1979 or 80. And I was so amazed at what was there. And so we began to talk, and a long story short, we agreed to buy his whole inventory of parts that he had. And I took a group of employees. We flew to Vegas, and we rented 3 U-Haul trucks, the 15, 16-foot U-Haul trucks.
Right.
And I told him, I said, we're only going to buy what I can fit in these 3 trucks. And we spent about a week there. Hot. Oh, it was miserably hot. I found out what a swamp cooler was back then. And so, but we loaded for almost a week until we had those 3 trucks completely filled. And we sent those trucks back down to Florida and unloaded them and began to advertise those things in our magazine. And we were shocked at the response. We bought like 40 pairs of 1955 rocker moldings. And, we didn't know what was the best way to mark them up. We looked at what everybody else was selling them for, and we marked them up. And we flew through those NOS parts in about a year.
Wow.
And
that's crazy.
And so I approached Doug because there were so many things that weren't reproduced. Eventually found a company out in Southern California that was fantastic at chrome plating. They were right at the border. Most of the employees had worked for them for years. They were artisans, but they came across the border every morning to a shop in the southern edge of San Diego, and they re-chromed parts. And I told Doug, I said, what we need to do is we need to take bumpers in. We can be the only ones that have re-chrome bumpers. You can call up and you can send us your cores, but instead of waiting 2 months or 3 months to get them plated, we can sell those. And so it was decided by the early 1980s that we needed to have a used parts department and that we needed to begin to buy parts cars. And back in 81, 82, 83, it was relatively easy. We'd built a building, but we ran out of space within 2 years.
That sounds about right.
And so then we built another building in Apopka, and we built a 22,000 square foot warehouse. We had a 5-acre plot of land. And so we began to buy cars. And we used those cars both for research, as we began to contract with companies to make a few parts. We still made some parts, but not a large number.
Right.
But also when the parts were made, we wanted to make sure that they fit. And we had one employee that we put in charge of taking every new part that was out there, fitting it on a car, making an evaluation, and publishing that. We didn't mind if we had a bad part that we would say, hey, gang, this is the only part that's out there, but it's better than nothing, so use it.
Right.
and we rated them, and we began to realize that we had to fill in the blanks. No one back then even thought of making a two-door front seat or a back seat or the bumpers, and the fenders. And so what happened was we began to touch that vein, and it was amazing how it began to work out. I realized that the best place to buy parts was at the big swap meet in California, Pomona. And I remember flying out there, having a couple of friends in California that I stayed with, and going to Pomona and spending $5,000 and nothing flat. Eventually, I would hire a group of high school students to work a weekend for me, and we would attend the Pomona swap meet. It was primarily a Sunday event. We'd arrive first thing in the morning, and I would have a group of high school kids that would follow me. I'd buy the parts. They would take them back to a central location where we had them. I had rented an old farm building down in San Diego, and when the event was over, we'd transport everything down. I had a former high school student of mine that was living down in San Diego, and he had a pickup, and we'd have a trailer, and we'd haul all that stuff down, put it in the barn, and then I would pay this gentleman to hire high school kids. We bought a media blaster, and we would clean pieces up. We'd find the most beautiful 55, 6, and 7 fenders. We'd go to a glass company and get wooden crates to put the used fenders in, and we would ship all over the United States, and it worked.
Yeah.
Now,
so you would advertise
in the magazine.
So you would take pictures, or you would just
take pictures and run the picture. Here's a set of 56 fenders. We have 2 sets, and here's the price. And they would call an order, and then we'd have the guys in California ship them out.
Okay. So it's crazy to me, like, you're thinking about it now, like the idea of maybe you could have just opened up a Classic Chevy also in California and had one in Florida.
Right.
Had that ever come up, or just...
Well, by 1988, that portion of the business had really grown. I was flying out there every other month. I never missed a Pomona. And I had to hire people there to do the work. And yes, we literally began to state that we will ship from Classic Chevy West.
Okay.
But we never formalized it because it was near that time that Classic Chevy changed hands.
Got it.
And the new entities decided that was not the way they wanted to have a business run from 2 locations.
Sure. Now, going back to thinking about, like, because right now information is so easily accessible and you can find out about companies anywhere doing whatever. But so you said you found that chroming company in San Diego. Like, how would you have, was that just word of mouth?
Probably word of mouth. Because we had so many local chapters, we ran, from the first year we existed, we started running one major international convention. It was a week long. It started on a Sunday evening, ended on a Thursday night.
Week long.
Week long. Very family orientated, very wholesome.
Right.
We tried to make it a really clean. At that convention, we had seminars. We would bring glass guys in. I taught classes on judging. We would bring in Chevrolet people that had been in the hobby for years, and Dick Miller from Trim Parts, and all kinds of people that we would invite in. We eventually became friends with various officials from General Motors and their arts department, their design department, and so we would have all these seminars. And we would have 1,000-point judging of the cars. We would have all kinds of cruises and picture taking, and we made it a 4-day convention that was just filled with fun and just all kinds of things that we did. And so what happened was, as we began to grow, the local chapters would approach us. Southern California. We had Southern California Classic Chevys. And they said, hey, we want to host an event. And so we decided, after lots of planning, that we would have one international convention 1 week long, but then we would sanction local events.
Right.
They had to abide by our judging guidelines and all of our different things, but we would advertise the event, and it was Classic Chevy International's regional event, and we held those like in Phoenix, Arizona, all over the place.
Yeah.
And
would you guys go?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we made sure that we were always with all the staff at the International, but usually one or two of us would go to those regional events. Well, when you would be at a regional event, you'd get acquainted with all of the people that were there, and you would begin to discuss, this and that. And that's how we learned about the plating shop down in San Diego.
Okay.
That's how we learned about David Graham, who reproduced. Eventually, he took a niche, and all he did was literature. Huh. And so he made literature we still buy from David Graham to this day, the literature that he had. That's how we met the Danchuk brothers. That's how we got acquainted with cars in Michigan. Ciadella's, Peter Ciadella had started Ciadella Interiors, had warehouses of NOS material, and he would reproduce that. And so it was those regional events that we would go and we would meet people and we would say, how can we do this together? How can we team up?
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking as you're talking, so you started off with this core group of people who had cars. They sent you the pictures of these cars. Yep. And then it kind of blossomed into parts for the cars,
yep,
clubs for the cars.
Right.
And then I would imagine it just kind of took on a life of its own because
right.
Anyone who may have ever thought about restoring a car now had this momentum of their friends doing it.
Right.
Oh, you got to do this. It's so much fun. And then it had to just multiply like crazy.
It did.
And was it always just I'm a Tri-5 guy, or was it well, I've always kind of liked them and it's so easy to do, so maybe I'll just do it. How do you think that happened?
That's a really excellent question. It was 1978, the winter of 1978. No, I take that. The winter of 1979. When I taught high school, I was the ski club sponsor, and I would take a group of students from Wisconsin to Colorado to ski up in the mountains. And when I left, the vice principal of the school, one of my high school buddies, college buddies, took my place, and he brought students out. And we were meeting we were staying in Dillon, Colorado. And one night while we were there, I told him, I said, we get all these high school kids. Let's you and I just go out to supper so we can really spend some time. And I was telling him about how excited I was about 55, 6, and 7 Chevys, and that we really needed to begin to think about the future because there was a future in some of the other Chevys. And I'll never forget sitting in a little Mexican restaurant in Dillon, and I told him, I said, I think we will call the next group the late great Chevys. They'll be the 58 to 64 Chevys. And so we decided, I'll never forget, because as we finished the meal, my old friend, who was a vice principal of the school that we'd both taught at, he looked at me and he said, how do you think I would do doing something like that? And I looked at him and I said, you are one of the most organized people I ever know. He just finished getting his master's in high school administration.
Right.
And we said, come and work for us. It's just a shot in the dark. We'll pay you $1,000 a month, which he was still making as a teacher, and we'll see how it goes. Initially, John, we thought these two entities would get along very nicely. But there's something, not by all 55-7 Chevy guys, but there were just a lot of people that wanted to be exclusively 55, 6, and 7.
Kind of like the Nomad people.
Exactly. Just like the Nomad people. The leadership, Doug and I, and the other officers that we had a much more open, laissez-faire. But there were a lot of local chapters that just flat out did not. And so we ended up with Classic Chevy Club chapters and the late great Chevy Club chapters. I have to tell you this story. We decided one year that we would have not a joint event, but we would have the Classic Chevy event And it would be followed the very next week by the Late Great Chevy event at the same facilities.
Okay.
And we had a number of people that came and stayed for both. But by and large, it was pretty much a different group. But from the very beginning, we began to get that pushback that, the 58 to 64 guys didn't seem to care too much. Chevy was a Chevy. But there was something about the 55, 6, and 7 Chevy that they were really exclusive.
Yeah.
And so we tried to do some joint ventures. The second one that we did, we ran one here and separate a week apart, but at the same facility. One of our next adventures was doing a joint show run at the same time with all the different divisions. And one of our local chapters, actually a chapter up in Jacksonville, Florida, we began to advertise in the two publications, because we had separate publications then. And I'll never forget, the local chapter in Jacksonville decided they were going to boycott the event. And I remember sitting down and trying to write to them and ask them what their reasoning was. And I'll never forget, I got a letter back, and I will quote from the letter. You simply cannot unugly a 1958 Chevy. And so...
That's rude.
So we still had a joint event, but the closest big chapter that we had one in Orlando, but the closest big chapter was up in Jacksonville, and they chose not to come down as a group. There were a couple of them that came. So we had to learn those things that we just, human nature and exclusivity.
And you probably had no idea that...
No, we had no idea.
Yeah. How funny. Well, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a period on Classic Chevy, and at the next episode, we'll get into Late Great and how that happened. So a whole lot of info. Thank you so much, Danny, for being here.
Well, my pleasure. It's been fun. I love the Chevrolet hobby. When I look back over my life, when I graduated from college, in my wildest dreams, I would have never thought that I would have ended up having such an incredible job and working in such a unique industry, niche industry. And it's been fun to be part of what that has become. Sad in ways, but we can talk about that in the future as well.
Sure. Well, thanks again, and we'll be seeing you soon.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
See you.